Well, thank you. Thank you so much. I should mention that I am the soon to be retired executive director at the Wisconsin Institute for Healthy Aging. So, listening to some of what you all have going on is really kind of inspiring. And after 30 years and working in older adult programs and nonprofits, you'd think I'd have this thing down by now. But I'm really glad to have this opportunity to talk to you today about social isolation and loneliness, albeit through a screen, as was mentioned, thanks to COVID. It is not lost on me that I am isolating while talking about the importance of not isolating. So nevertheless, today I'm going to talk about what we're learning about the health impacts and what we at the Wisconsin Coalition to End Social Isolation and Loneliness are doing about that. So I'm going to provide you with a brief overview of what the coalition is and about, discuss the prevalence and impact of social isolation and loneliness, and then talk about the national and local agenda, including some strategies and activities that are happening in Wisconsin and throughout the country. I also want to just acknowledge that this talk is really focused on older adults and with people with disabilities, but that clearly young people have significant social isolation and loneliness impacts that are in rising and significant numbers. So I just want to acknowledge that that's the case. So the Wisconsin Coalition to End Social Isolation and Loneliness was formed at the end of 2020 in response to the pandemic, but also in light of emerging evidence of the public health impacts of social isolation and loneliness. Initially, the group included representatives from the Bureau of Aging and Disability Resources at the Department of Health Services, our organization, WIHA, AARP Wisconsin, the Greater Wisconsin Agency on Aging Resources, which is an area agency on aging in Wisconsin, the Senior Center Association. There were a number of sort of aging-focused organizations, and we've gone on to include groups for people representing folks with disabilities, including the Board for People with Developmental Disability and others. Since then, we've grown to include over 100 different individuals representing 300 individuals representing over 100 different organizations around the state. And our focus is really around raising awareness. So we're really looking to raise public awareness with the public, but also with decision makers. Detecting or identifying people who are lacking social connections and respond with resources, services, interventions, scanning the environment for and curating research, data, and interventions or best practices around social isolation and loneliness, and then developing policy initiatives and advocacy efforts to address the problem. Social isolation and loneliness is not new, obviously, but it's now recognized as more than just kind of a sad circumstance that happened to people at various points in their life, and not all people, but some. It's a public health problem now with very real physical, emotional, and psychological health impacts. The U.S. Surgeon General, Dr. Vivek Murthy, released an advisory this past May outlining the scope and health impacts of the problem, along with a series of strategies for addressing it. We in the U.S. weren't the first to recognize and act on this as a public health issue. In the UK and Japan, both have cabinet-level ministers of loneliness, and since about 2018, I think that they've had those high-level representatives concerned about loneliness and isolation. The World Health Organization has also raised alarm bells around the impact worldwide. So in the US, though, there have been studies that have revealed the deep value of social connection. In the Harvard study of adult development, scientists began tracking the health of 268 Harvard sophomores in 1938 during the Great Depression. And added to that number over time. Clearly they had to add additional folks to the initial study folks. So it's been about 85 years since the study has been going on. And what they found is that strong relationships and social connection were major predictors of longevity. Likewise, the researchers with a group called the Blue Zones found that after identifying and studying 7 different places with out of the ordinary longevity, that purposefulness and social connection were invaluable in terms of having healthy, long lives. So a couple of definitions. Oftentimes social isolation and loneliness are conflated because they're often referenced together. We almost make it one word. Social isolation and loneliness is one thing. But really they're two distinct things. While they both have this similar negative health impacts, including physical and mental health impacts. But social isolation really refers to the number of people you're in contact with. It's an objective measure of the number of contacts or relationships a person has. Loneliness, on the other hand, is a subjective feeling. It's a distressing feeling about lacking the number and depth of the social contacts and relationships that you have. Social connection is really the sense of belonging due to the number and importance of relationships that people feel. So creating social connections in some ways is the absence of isolation and loneliness, but it's the degree to which people have and perceive the right number of connections or relationships, the quality of those relationships, and the diversity of those relationships that makes them feel cared for, valued, and supported. So this is from the Surgeon General's report this past May, and it tracks national trends in connection. So between 2003 and 2020, they tracked several data points, and there are others. I encourage you, if you're interested in this topic, to go take a look at the Surgeon General's report. It's a very interesting read. But here are a couple of data points that are of interest. Social isolation increased by 24 hours per month. And you can see, so starting in 2003, there was a big jump where, social isolation began to really increase at a rapid rate around 2020, which makes sense because we were moving into the pandemic. Household, family, social engagement. So engagement within a home between family members decreased by about 5 hours a month from 2003, and that was a steady decline. Companionship decreased by about 14 hours a month prior to the pandemic, and then a big drop, but not right at 2020. That there was a sort of general trending downward from about the mid 20 teens to about 2020. And I think that, watching the trends and seeing where these sort of transition points are and looking at what was happening sort of in the world in those periods of time can be illuminating. So what makes a person more or less susceptible to isolation and loneliness and a lack of connection? So these are some of the factors that impact social connection. Physical health problems. So obviously, if you have physical health problems, chronic conditions, that leads to a decrease in social connection. Sensory and functional impairment. So people who have disabilities or who have impaired hearing, impaired vision, other sensory and functional impairment also experience or are it's a factor for them in terms of their level of social connection. Mental health challenges also often decrease social connection. Technology use, and that has a tendency to do one of two things. It can increase your level of social connection, but it also has a potential to decrease your level of social connection depending what you're using your technology for. And if it's keeping you from engaging with people because you're engaging with the screen. Personality, extroverts versus introverts can have a difference in terms of their feelings of connection. Race, minority populations tend to have decreased social connection. Socioeconomic status, the lower your socioeconomic status, the less social connection, and then also life stage, and this is true at both ends of the spectrum. Sort of in those places where at younger years where you're developing connections, and in older years where sometimes those connections are lost due to losing people in our lives. Likewise, relationships have an impact. So the structure, function, and quality of a relationship, those that are more stable, supportive, those relationships tend to improve social connection. So household size, the more people in a household, the better social connection. That just makes sense, right? The better social connection people tend to have. And then the characteristics and behaviors of others. How is the person treated by others within their circle of social relationships? Do others exhibit healthy behaviors around them? So all of those things are factors in social connection. Likewise, community, like, is there outdoor space and places to connect with each other within the community? Housing, homes and neighborhoods designed to enhance connection. Community organizations, are there community organizations on the ground, programs and services that enhance connections there? Healthcare, we know that people in poor health are more likely to be socially isolated and lonely, and do people have access to care? So transportation, also, do people have access to rides that get them out of the home? And then finally, society. What are the norms and values of your community? Sort of those unwritten rules that communicate approval or disapproval of certain attitudes and behaviors. Communities that embrace positive, healthy actions versus negative or conflicting ones nurture social connection. And lastly, public policy and civic engagement. So what do local policies, are there local policies that recognize connection and civic engagement support? So what are the public health implications? And this was a big shock, I think, to a lot of us when we first read this in the report, but half of US adults experienced loneliness even before the pandemic. Again, all this data was created before the pandemic. And then the increased risk for early death for people who are lacking social connections is as much as smoking up to 15 cigarettes a day. So it's pretty dramatic in terms of the public health impact. Continuing with that, 29% increased risk of heart disease for people who lack social connection, a 32% increased risk of stroke, 50% increased risk of dementia, significant increases in risk for depression and anxiety, and finally, increased susceptibility to infectious disease. So how social connection influences health is kind of interesting. So it basically influences health in three ways. It has an impact on biology. So the fewer connections you have, increased stress hormones, inflammation in the body, and gene expression. So that's a process of turning DNA information into sort of a function in the body. Psychologically, having few connections impacts your level and feelings of meaning and purpose in your life, increases feelings of stress and decreases feelings of safety, decreased resilience and hopefulness or outlook when you have few social connections. Interestingly, and another example of the mind-body connection, we do know that positive perceptions of aging have a great deal to do with healthy aging and longevity. So to the tune of a 7.5-year longevity bonus for people who think positively about growing older. So that's I think an important, we've been learning that with ageism, that people who perceive of aging as a positive versus a negative really tend to do much better just from a health perspective as they age. And then finally, behaviors. So lack of social connection decreases the likelihood that people will have healthy behaviors. So they will probably do less physical activity. They probably will not have as good a nutrition. They may not sleep as well. And they may not access healthcare at the appropriate points. And they may also have, increased negative health behaviors such as smoking and other things. So all of these factors are what combined to create the negative health impacts when a person lacks social connection. Well, lest you think that all we're doing here is admiring the problem, which is a favorite phrase of mine that I've shamelessly stolen from Al Franken. We are working to address the issue by embracing the 6 pillars of social connection outlined in the Surgeon General's report. So that's kind of a roadmap for action to reduce social isolation and loneliness and increase social connection. So I just want to talk through these with you briefly, so you get a sense of what we are doing with the coalition and what these pillars are recommending. So strengthen social infrastructure, the layout of communities, sort of the whole movement toward livable communities is sort of embraced here. So how do we design the built environment to promote social connection? And that includes things like housing for older people and people with disabilities that embraces or infuses connection. Transportation. Do people have access to public or community-led transportation services? And our Aging and Disability Resource Centers are able to provide some of those resources. How about community spaces and green spaces? Do we have places where people can connect? Those are kind of critical components of the built environment to sort of enhance social connection. Establish and scale community connection programs. So every community is different and has different assets, but most have or can leverage existing programs into providing deeper connections, or they can start programs to create connections. And I have a few examples of that coming up. And then lastly, investing in local institutions like libraries and senior centers, and independent living centers, community centers. These are places where we can be creative. We can offer volunteer opportunities. We can create opportunities with intention for interpersonal connections, intergenerational connections. So I think there's much we can do here. And I just wanted to give you a couple of examples of programs that are designed, that programs that can be brought to communities to create connection. There are lots of different examples, but here are a couple. And the first one is something out of the UK, and it really focuses around engaging with animals. This is called Hen Power. And what they did was they brought the residents of a senior living facility, and they brought in chickens in a chicken coop and tasked them with taking care of these animals. And what they found was that the residents felt much more purposeful. They felt like they had a job to do, a reason to get up in the morning. They felt a connection with one another as they were caring for these animals. And they certainly felt a connection to the animals themselves. So there's other examples of things like this that are happening sort of in different communities with different kinds of animals. But I thought this was interesting because it was built predominantly for the reason of creating connections. Then there are other types of programs like tech connection programs. There's one through AARP called Big and Mini that connects older adults and young people around technology, and one teaches the other. There's Sage Connect, specifically for LGBTQ seniors to provide connections for each other. There's a Oshkosh Senior Center just recently did a program called Connect Through Tech that they were funded to sort of amp up the idea of training older adults so they can connect with family members and each other. And then there's one that I really love called Men's Sheds, and it's basically a club mainly for older men. Some, get together and do building or other kinds of projects, woodworking and other things. Sometimes they just get together to hang out and play cards, but the focus is for creating connections for men with each other, because sometimes those are challenging things for older men to do, is develop new relationships. So there are several of these men's sheds in Wisconsin, and we think it's an interesting and innovative way to create connections. The other thing we need to do is get very intentional about leveraging existing programs to create connections. And so here's a few other examples of what has been done. This is a library in Denmark where you can borrow a person instead of borrowing a book, to listen to their life story for 30 minutes and to talk with them a little bit about their experiences and to create some kind of connection. It's called the Human Library. And this has been going on now for a while, and it's already like sort of moved into 50 different countries. And my question is, what could we do here? We have libraries in many communities. What kind of programs could we bring in that would create some natural connections? Similarly, most communities have home delivered, Meals on Wheels, congregate meal programs. There's a researcher at Dartmouth that we recently connected with who's looking at an intervention that uses technology and trained volunteers to help homebound older adults who are part of the home delivered meal program to create their own kind of action plan for creating connections. It's called a brief behavioral activation for improving social connectedness. I think they need another name. But what else could we do within the home delivered meal program to be intentional about enhancing connections? We're already doing the service. What else can we bring to the program that would create meaningful connections for people? And then other programs, things around exercise, volunteer programs. There's many things that older people and people with disabilities can tap into. How do we create intention around making those programs create deeper connections for the people who are participating in them? Pillar 2, enacting pro-connection public policies. And this really relates to sort of adopting a connection in all policies approach. So sort of looking from a bird's eye view, and establishing cross-departmental leadership at all levels of government that makes connection a priority by developing and overseeing an overarching social connection strategy, working to establish policies that create or enhance connection. And what the coalition is doing, the Wisconsin Coalition to End Social Isolation and Loneliness is doing, is monitoring legislation now. And we're also working on a white paper on broadband access in Wisconsin that we think has potential to, help support some of the efforts to expand access to broadband. The third pillar, mobilizing the health sector. And so there's a lot of work to do here, but the idea is to, really work with healthcare providers, given the public health implications of loneliness and isolation, to both recognize the physical and mental health benefits of social connection, as well as the risks associated with social disconnection, and incentivize providers to educate patients as part of preventive care. We can work with healthcare providers to also assess for social disconnection and respond to patients' health relevant social needs. Also looking to expand the public health role in terms of, public health agencies developing tracking systems, potentially promoting best practices and community solutions, and of course, emphasizing prevention. Reforming digital environments, this is something that's a little bit hard to do at the state level, but we recognize the need, and at a minimum requiring data transparency and safety standards so people feel safe making connections online, particularly when, and we know this with some older people, not all older people, but technology can be a little bit more challenging. So having a little bit more self-confidence and knowing that there's transparency in how data is handled is important. And then supporting development of pro-connection technologies. Deepening our knowledge is pillar 5. So we really, are looking at the national research agenda. How do we make research a priority and allocate funds that are commensurate with public health impact? Identifying evidence-based strategies and interventions that can be deployed and scaled. So those are we really see research and funding of interventions as being kind of a priority. And then increasing public awareness. So we really want to get to a common understanding of the essential role of social connection in health and well-being. We want this to be, something that is not a surprise or news to people, but that they have a good understanding of it. And then also an understanding of the strategies that people can employ to establish meaningful connections. And this needs to start in childhood and be reinforced throughout life. What the Wisconsin Coalition to End Social Isolation and Loneliness is doing is we just recently completed our Loneliness and Social Isolation Awareness Week, which is November 12th through the 23rd. And we did a variety of different things. We did letters to the editor and press releases. We did a series of webinars on several topics related to the issue. We did some social media. We did Wisconsin Public Radio for an hour. We did a spot on WISC. So we really are trying to just raise awareness of the issue. And here are a few of the graphics that we put together to just really drive home. And these are things that people used on their own social media, but like tips for building connections and volunteering, make your random act of kindness a random act of connection. That was kind of our hook for this year. So there were a variety of things there as well. And you can find all those things if you run out to our Facebook page. And finally, and perhaps the biggest challenge of all, is cultivating a culture of connection. And what that really means is infusing the values of kindness, respect, service, commitment to one another, into the norms and culture of how we engage one another. This needs to be modeled in leadership at all levels and within all institutions. And we need to expand conversations on connection. And what we're doing is we hope to provide a venue for this kind of a dialogue at a summit this coming year. And we're working to develop messaging and discussion points to begin and reframe the way we talk to one another. So what can you do? I invite you to join the movement. So there's a link below there, and I'm not sure if you're going to be able to access this, but I'm also happy to provide contact information. Think about how your business, industry, or organization can play a role. And I encourage you to personally reach out to family, friends, neighbors to provide a meaningful connection to them, people that you know may be isolated. It starts with us. Like it starts, one person at a time. So I think I'm probably over time. Sorry about that, but thank you so much for the opportunity to talk with you today.